everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. And today we are going to talk about investor visa options and considerations. So we're going to talk about the different types of investor visas that are available to you. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. First and foremost, if you, in terms of when this presentation is done, what we will send you is a number of different things. We will send you the PowerPoint presentation that's being displayed on the screen. We'll also send you guides to each of the different visa options that we go through today. So the guides go over really in a fair amount of detail the requirements that we're going to talk about today. And also we'll send you this webinar is being recorded. So we also will send you the recording, and the webinars actually do get put on YouTube. So once they are converted to YouTube format, you can see them on YouTube, and we'll send you that link. And we do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel because we do regularly post videos to the channel, and you can access those videos and hit the notification button, because you will be notified of new videos. We post multiple videos on a daily basis. If you do have questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat box or the Q&A box. We will get to all questions. We may not answer them as soon as you ask them. However, we will get to all questions during the presentation. Yes, and without further ado, I think we will get started and go through the slides. So, just the first slide is really just a summary of the different types of visa options that we're going to speak about today. And really, the E2 visa, that's one that some of you may be aware of, that the firm was founded on an E2 visa. That's so that one is near and dear to our hearts. We're going to also talk about the National Interest Waiver, which is a green card category that is very popular with entrepreneurs. We're going to touch base very briefly on the International Entrepreneur Rule. Unfortunately, that's a investor option that really hasn't gained the traction that we would have liked it to have gained. So there are very few applications that have actually been filed to date. So we won't spend a lot of time on that because it's not a highly recommended investor visa option. And then finally, we're going to talk about the EB-5 green card. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with all of these visa options is that we do have separate webinars on each of these. So each webinar could be an hour or even longer in terms of the length. And really, the point of today is really to touch on these visa options. So we're not going to go into any particular visa option in a significant amount of detail, but we'll touch on the visa option. And then really what you can do, as I said, you can go to the YouTube channel and you can see one of our previous webinars on this particular topic, or you could actually go to the webinar sign up list and sign up for another webinar. And during the presentation as well, we will closer to the end, we will talk about some other kind of investor visa options that aren't really as typically used, but we will touch on them. So I know someone's written a question asking about L1. So we will touch on that during the presentation as well, even if it's as part of answers to the questions that come in. So first and foremost, the first investor visa option that we're going to talk about. I say first and foremost because, as I said, it's a visa that the firm was founded on. So again, one that's very near and dear to us. But the E2 visa requirements, kind of first and foremost, is that you have to be a national from a treaty country. A national from a treaty country means that you have a passport from that country. So this particular option is not dependent on where you're born, but if you have a passport, so for example, you could be born in China, but have a passport from Taiwan. So you have a Chinese passport and a Taiwanese passport. And if you had the Taiwanese passport and Taiwan is a treaty country, then you could meet the threshold requirement of being eligible to apply. There are about 80 or so treaty countries that are available, and they span the globe. There are countries in Africa. There are many countries in Europe. We have Canada. We have Mexico in North America. And then we also have a number of different countries in South America that are eligible. So first and foremost, though, what happens with respect to this visa, or the main requirement with respect to this visa, is that you invest money. So you are going to make an investment in the United States, and that investment is going to be made to either purchase a business or to start a business. So when you a few things with respect to the investment, the funds do have to be at risk. So what that means is that you have actually spent money, right? So putting money in a business bank account and having the money sitting there is not going to be sufficient for an E2 visa. The government really wants to see that not that you're just planning to start a business, but that you actually have taken steps to put your own capital at risk. So the other important thing with respect to the investment, you do have to show where the money came from. All of the money has to have come from a legitimate source. So, the money could come from a gift, it could come from a loan, but then once you do, it could come from your personal savings, like if you were working over years. But once you do indicate where the money came from, then you actually have to prove that the money came from a legitimate source. So if someone gave you a gift, you can't just say, well, so-and-so, my brother gave me a gift. You would then have to show where your brother got the money from. So if your brother had a job and saved money over time, you might have to show tax returns and bank statements to prove that the money came from a legitimate source. The other big requirement for the investment is that the investment must be substantial, but we're going to save that description for the next slide. When you look at typical things that people spend money on, it's really going to be anything that is required to get the business up and running. So it can be rent, it can be marketing. It could be that the particular business, let's say you're doing a smoke shop or a convenience store. It could be inventory that's going to be required to get the business up and running. You could have employees that you've spent money on, because when you by the time you start by the time you apply for the E2, the business has to be either running or just at the point of starting operation. So all of these things, a lot of people ask the question, when do I have to spend the money? Well, the money has to be spent before you apply, right? It's not the government isn't looking for people who intend to start a business. They're looking for people who have made very significant steps towards actually starting that business. The next thing to kind of go over briefly is, just kind of the difference between starting a business and buying one. If you do buy a business, the funds can be still at risk if you put the money in escrow. And when the funds are put in escrow, that the only condition related to the whether the funds are transferred to the seller is the approval of the E2 visa. So you can't have a condition, for example, of condition related to due diligence or anything like that. That might be practical from a business perspective, but it wouldn't work in terms of putting the money at risk. That is so the only condition. So if you could transfer, instead of transferring the money to the seller, you could transfer the money to an escrow agent. The escrow agent can hold the money in an account, and then the escrow agreement would say that if the E2 visa is approved, the money goes to the seller, and if the E2 visa is not approved, then it goes back to the buyer. So it relieves a little bit of the pressure of having the seller hold on to your money if in fact the visa doesn't get approved. The other thing with respect to the E2, and this is really what E2 visas are all about, you're going to have to hire U.S. workers, right? So, you may not have to have employees right when you start the business, but you will have to include a business plan to show who it is you plan on hiring over time. And, over a 5-year period, you should have at least the equivalent of 3 full-time workers working for you. W-2 employees are better than contractors, but a combination can work as well. We talked about this a little bit already. The business has to be real and operating. It can be even taking in revenue. But with us, we look to make sure that everything is started. Like you have a lease signed, the business has been set up, the website's been created. You're really ready to start business. We had one client that was applying, and she was setting up a gym. And when she went to her interview, the officer said, well, so if I went to the gym right now, what would I see? And she said, the equipment's all purchased, the lease has been signed, the employees are there, and all they're really waiting for is me and to get the visa. And that's really what the officer was waiting to hear. Also, the person has to be coming to the US to develop and direct the operation. So passive investments don't work for E2. It does have to be an active business and you have to be planning planning to come to the US to actually manage the business. So you can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to purchase a restaurant and, give the seller $300,000 and then hire someone to manage it, and then I'm going to, retire and stay in the US. That doesn't work. You do have to develop and direct the operation. You do have to own, if you're applying for an E2 investor visa, it's required that you own at least 50% of the business. And then you do have to have the intent to return to your home country. And that usually can be satisfied if and when you no longer have the E2. So this is a visa that can be renewed indefinitely. So you can stay in the US indefinitely on this visa as long as the business continues to be operational and hires US workers. But if you did, for example, let's say you bought a restaurant and you got an E2 visa, but then you sold the restaurant, then you would have to return to your home country or another country or find another visa to stay in the US. So now we mentioned this earlier related to how much you have to invest. So the E2 visa doesn't have a specific amount that is required in terms of an investment. Instead, the regulations use the term that the investment amount has to be substantial. So there's no set dollar amount. And what we look at here is the type of business that you have. So if someone's opening up a restaurant, that might require, because you look at the type of business and you look at how much does it cost to get that particular business up and running. So if someone's opening up a restaurant, that might require, hundreds of thousands of dollars or depending on the restaurant to get the business up and running, versus if someone is starting a consulting company, that might require a very, very much smaller investment amount. So you'd be looking at what's required to start the investment. And for smaller investments, so when I say smaller investments, really anything under the $500,000 mark, you really are looking for the applicant to spend all of the money related to get that particular business set up. So, if you were looking to buy a restaurant for 300,000, you would have to, or start a restaurant and everything getting that restaurant up and running would cost 300,000. You would be required to actually spend that and then apply for the E2 visa. Sometimes for situations where you have lower dollar amounts, where you have, consulting businesses or something like that, and things that you do to kind of explain why the investment amount is lower is perhaps include a CPA letter or include articles that describe that, this particular business is one that doesn't require a significant amount of money to get started. So those are some of the things you might include. If you are purchasing a business, the fair market is going to be the fair market value of the actual business. If it's an arm's length transaction, if you are buying from a related party, then you may want to get a valuation of the business done to show the government that you actually are investing a substantial amount, i.e. what the business is actually worth. Franchises are great options for E2 visas. When you're looking at expenditures, there are good and bad expenditures, and we go into these in a lot more detail in one of our webinar, but good expenditures are the ones we've talked about in this webinar, like inventory, rent, employees, etc. Whereas things like travel or training, it's training/education, or meals, things like that, those aren't, those unfortunately are not great expenditures, and consulates do kind of warn about including those types of expenditures in a file. So the next investor visa option that we're going to talk about is the National Interest Waiver. So this is the under the EB2 category, and this is actually a green card, right? So this is one that if you have an interest in getting a green card in the United States, this is definitely an option to look for. And this particular option is one that became available after in I think it was 2016, 2017, after an appeals board decided a case. The name of the case was called Danisar, and Danisar made it very clear that entrepreneurs could apply for this particular green card. And I'm going to go in reverse order of the slide. So when we're looking at this particular option, there are really three requirements at the bottom of the slide. The three requirements for National Interest Waiver, and the first requirement is that you prove that the proposed endeavor. So you're looking at the endeavor. What is it the person says is they're going to do? And that particular endeavor has to have substantial merit or national importance, right? So this particular requirement, this one is a little easier to prove than you'll see when we get to the second requirement, because you have a lot of flexibility with respect to how you craft this, right? Like what is it that you plan on doing? And so let's say someone wants to start a cybersecurity company, and they might say that, well, that's nationally important because point to a number of experts, a number of articles that talk about why cybersecurity is important, and they may say that they're going to work with people in government, protecting government from cybersecurity, but also work with a number of different companies and organizations, and protect their systems, and then indicate what the benefit of that is. So substantial merit, national importance is prong number one. But then the second prong, we move away from, what is it that is going to be done, or what's the endeavor, and now we move to the actual individual. So we look at the individual and we ask the question of, is the person well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor? And this is always the much more difficult one with National Interest Waiver, because now we're saying, are they well positioned to advance the endeavor that we just described in point one, right? So if you described an endeavor that was not nationally important because of size, or just because it was, the government didn't consider it that important, then that might be easy to achieve point two. But if you described a national endeavor where you said that you're going to be providing consulting services to government, to a large number of organizations, et cetera, then prong two becomes more difficult, because then prong two, it's not just the idea that you're going to be providing cybersecurity services, but it is who you're going to be providing them to, and are you going to be able to provide them to a large number of people that you said you are going to be able to provide them for, such that it is of national interest, right? Because it's not just the national interest is not just going to be an idea of cybersecurity or any other buzzword. It's not just going to be an idea, but it's going to be that idea combined with what it is you actually are proposing in terms of doing. So here we look at the education, we look at the person's background or experience, but much more important than that, we look at like how far along are they with respect to this, or how certain is it that they're going to be able to do this. So we might look at, do they have adequate investment to move this forward. We might look at their own track record to see, have they started companies before where they've been able to hire U.S. workers. So all of that are things that you're going to look at to make a determination as to whether or not this is possible. And then finally, the last prong is just looking at, because normally for green cards under the employment-based category, you have to show that you can't qualify, you can't find a qualified U.S. worker, and that whole process is called a labor certification process. So this third prong is saying, why on balance should they waive the labor certification process? And often we're going to point to the fact that entrepreneurs generally can't sponsor themselves, but also we're going to point to all of the fantastic things that we may have pointed out in prong one and prong two, but then other important things that the particular applicant may have done to sway the government that on balance, it's good to waive the labor certification. Now, the first part of the slide, I'm not going to touch on it much, but it's just a threshold requirement. So EB2, National Interest Waiver, falls under EB2, which is EB2 covers National Interest Waiver, but it also covers when a company wants to sponsor you for a green card. So in order to even think about doing an EB2, you have to either have an advanced degree, which is a master's degree or higher, or its equivalent, and the equivalent is defined as a bachelor's degree plus 5 years experience. Or you can get into this category by exceptional ability, and you look at the exceptional ability. If you meet 3 of the requirements that are listed on this slide, then you could qualify under exceptional ability. But just keep in mind, you have to have one of these: advanced degree, bachelor's plus 5 years of work experience, or exceptional ability, before you can even consider moving to this particular category. So a few things with National Interest Waiver is that the benefit to the nation doesn't have to be every state. You can have national interest and substantial merit when you're looking at something local. So in Danisar, the court specifically moved the focus away from kind of large geographic scope, because there was another case that governed this before, and it really was, the national interest had a similar standard for prong one, and the national interest had to be geographic and cover a large geographic area. And we talked about the fact that entrepreneurs are self-employed and they're not eligible for green cards. So we argue that often with entrepreneurs when we do a national interest waiver. And the case does say that the plan doesn't ultimately have to be successful, but it has to show that it's more likely than not to succeed. So we thought it was worthwhile including a case study from a case that was submitted and ultimately approved, because it was submitted, denied, was appealed, and then was approved after it was appealed. And what it was an individual. He was setting up a small consulting firm to work with work on projects focused on improving services to U.S. vets, right? So in terms of the substantial merit and national importance, the person got some expert letters or a bunch of news media articles and other supporting documentation that showed that the government said that this was really important, right? And he, described, what it was he planned on doing and who he planned on reaching out to, and the government at the end, the courts in the end decided that this was, had substantial merit and national importance. They also indicated finally that the person was well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor. They had letters from government officials, businesses, showing, attesting to his prior successes working with veterans. There was a comprehensive business plan that laid out his activities. There were, it was a good business plan. There were emails, and letters of intent from prospective clients saying that they said that they wanted to work from with the company. And then there was also they showed that they had sufficient. The person showed that they had sufficient startup capital. And keep in mind that one of the things that struck me about this case when I read it is they mentioned multiple times that it was a small consulting company, right? Like, so to get a national interest waiver approved, it doesn't have to be kind of a large. That's going to help if the more you can point to more, it's going to help it. But it's something that can be small. The other kind of thing that to look at is that often, with this particular, when you're looking at national importance, one national importance aspect can just be job creation, right? So that's something that that can be used in the national importance, either in combination with or completely separate from the other national importance benefits. And then the person used the same argument that we talked about in terms of waiving the labor certification. Now, the international the parole entrepreneur parole program, we're not going to spend much time on it at all, but I'm just going to mention it and then move on. But it was a program that was initially introduced during the Obama administration, closer to the end. Then the next administration kind of scrapped it and didn't really do much with it. And then the Biden administration started and reintroduced the program, but it just really hasn't gained traction. I think there's only been one approval of this to date. And then basically it's I think if someone was eligible for an E2, they'd probably do that over this. But this is for people, a good example would be maybe a tech startup. So they own like a small percentage of the company. And then there are just some requirements with respect to owning percentage ownership. The business has to have some form of investment. You see the number there, 264,000. It's a kind of an odd number, but it's pegged to inflation. And then it can't just be investment from anyone. It has to be from specific types of investors, or it can be a grant or award, or you can show other evidence as to why this is particularly important. But again, it's one of those things where it just hasn't really gained much traction at all, and it's not really one that we it's not one that we really recommend to our not really one that we recommend to our clients at all at this point, given the state of things. And we do have a separate, as I said, we do have a separate webinar on that. So definitely feel free to go to the YouTube channel, because we stopped doing the actual live webinars for that particular program, just because it's we find that it's it's not that great of an option. And so the next investor visa option is another green card option. And this particular investor visa option is EB-5. So this is what people kind of refer to sometimes the $1 million green card. And what this particular program or green card option does is that it allows you to invest 800,000 or 1,050,000 in a new commercial enterprise. And that doesn't have to be a brand new enterprise. It can be an enterprise that was started after 1990. There's an exact date. And the 800,000, if you're investing the lower amount, the 800,000, that means that the business is located in what's called a targeted employment area, which is an area that is 1.5 times the unemployment rate is 1.5 times the national average, or it's located in what's called a rural area, and that's defined by the local jurisdiction. So, country area, low population. The 800,000 or the 1,050,000 has to be certain types of expenditures. So accounting, administrative fees can't be included, but you have to invest that money, and like we talked about with the E2, the money has to be at risk. So you can't just take the money and put it into a bank account and say I'm applying for an EB5. The investment can be made over time, so it doesn't have to be one investment that is made, but the investment should be made before you apply. And the other thing is, it has to be actual investment coming from your own personal funds. So if you, let's say you had an E2 business and you invested 100,000, then you started the E2 business, and the E2 business made a bunch of money, and there was like $1 million, and it was sitting in retained earnings. You couldn't just say, okay, well, that money I'm going to, say is EB5, I'm going to spend it and say it's EB5, that money's retained earnings. So you'd have to invest money from your personal funds. The other big thing with EB5 is that source of funds is a big issue with EB5. You do have to prove where the money came from. I know we talked about this with E2, but it's much more extensive, the requirement to document. So this is often an area where people get tripped up, and it does have to be some form of equity investment. So it can be, you can invest in a stock, it can be membership unit, it can be partnership unit. And unlike the E2, this can be passive investment. Like the wording in the statute doesn't exactly say that it's passive investment, but it can be structured so that the individual has very little involvement in the day-to-day operations of the company. The other big thing with EB5 is that you do have to create, the business has to create 10 full-time jobs. There's like E2, it's going to have a detailed business plan. The full-time jobs in this case are full-time jobs for US citizens or green card holders. So that's it. And it does, part-time jobs are not permitted. And because it's for green card holders and US citizens, you do have to kind of make sure that you are dotting your I's and crossing your T's with respect to people's eligibility to work in the US. So EB5 filing, we're going to file a petition called an I-526. And then one great thing about this now is that you can actually, if the person is in the United States, they can concurrently file an I-485, which given the very long processing times of these petitions, it does give them the ability to stay in the US for a fair amount of time, because these petitions are now taking over 4 years to be adjudicated. And if you do file in the US, you're able to stay in the US during that adjudication timeframe. So and then once you have the green card, then you have to come back in a couple of years and file another petition, an I-829 petition, showing that you have actually created the US jobs. So just briefly, some other options, like sometimes we see O1 being used for investor visas. So O1 is a visa that's based on extraordinary ability, and so sometimes we see people in the entrepreneur field. So they may, and what for O1, there are a list of 8 or so elements, and if you meet 3 of them, like, so for example, if you have a high salary, or you judge the work of others, or if you meet 3 of them, then it may be possible to apply under that category. And there is some kind of self-petitioning that's permitted there. But and as I said, we do have some extraordinary ability webinars, so definitely take a look at those. And then the other kind of option that someone had sent in a question asking about is an L1A. So that's an individual who has a business in their home country, and the business has people working there, employees working there, managers or executives, and they decide that either they or one of their managers or executives want to come to the United States to either set up operations or to work for a company that's already there, their company that's already there. So if it is setting up a new entity within the United States, Then it's called a new office L. So there has to be an entity abroad. There has to be employees abroad. The person that's transferring has to be a manager. It's L1A. They have to be a manager or executive and have that role. They have had to have had that role abroad, and then they have to have that role in the US. The issue with that particular visa is that the new office L is only issued for 1 year, and the problem with that is that it does at the end of that 1 year, they really are expecting a significant ramp up of employees in order to renew it so that the person can stay for another 3 years. So the last slide has just kind of a summary of the main visa types. We have the E2, subjective investment amount, no set number of employees. But then the big thing is that it's only for people from certain countries. Then we have National Interest Waiver. We're doing a lot more National Interest Waivers now, both converting people from E2 to National Interest Waiver or just people who, want National Interest Waiver. And the premium processing has been introduced for National Interest Waiver. They're kind of just catching it up because they're staggering it a little bit. But that makes it so that someone could actually get that particular, have that particular visa option relatively quickly. International Entrepreneur Rule, we told you that one. It's kind of just hasn't evolved the way we thought. And then EB5 to green card, recent changes to the program, but they're maybe not that recent anymore. But those mainly had to do with the change in investment amount and the fact that you could file the I-485 petition at the same time as the I-526. And then the 10 full-time employees is necessary for that as well. Excellent. So that is really all we have for today. And there was one question that we did answer during the presentation. So I don't see any additional questions. We'll give it a minute or two. I don't see any additional questions, but nope. Okay, perfect. Yeah, but so again, we're going to send out a copy of the presentation, send out a copy of the guide, send out the actual link, so you can, if there are points that you missed during the presentation, you can actually see them on our YouTube channel again. And we're also going to send you a link to a consultation where you can set up a consultation and speak to one of our lawyers to get information on any of these particular visa options. Thank you very much.